I was just looking at a picture of like a thumbnail of Elon Musk that which was like a part of some Bitcoin. Elon Musk on cryptocurrency or something. It was like a YouTube video. I'm looking at Elon's face. I'm just thinking, kind of, what do I feel about this human being? I was just thinking about that fact, about the fact that, yeah, people encounter themselves often in these big figures, and therefore everyone is receiving a different Elon Musk. We're not all, no one's talking about the same Elon Musk, really. Of course, it has a double aspect. They are and they aren't. They're talking about a shared something, which is this actual human being. And they're talking also about a shared experience of that human being, which would have to do with that human being's persona. And the persona is very interesting because it partakes both of internal and external definitions. It's both individually architected, unconsciously architected. So it's both kind of individual consciously architected, individual unconsciously architected, and then collective consciously architected and unconsciously architected. That's an interesting cross. Conscious and unconscious, collective and individual. Put them all together, you get history or something. Because this is true, it means something very specific about the ways in which performers interact with groups. Okay, so there are multiple aspects of this. First thing I'd say is there's something about the group that launches an emergent autonomous process, which is just what we'd call mob mentality or groupthink. These are kind of silly words to refer to something not silly at all. I think of it like a kind of animal or a demon that's been summoned, conjured. The larger the group, the more power this monster has. The blood pyramid itself is perhaps something like this, by the way. It's a big group effect. Now, I'm not exactly sure, of course, how this works, but it seems to me that there's some kind of a weakness or a trade in power or emphasis that's made when these funny group effects constellate out of human beings. Let's say something like a mob. Like if you look at what a mob is, quite a lot of power and autonomy is obtained. Now, I mean autonomy here in a funny way because it's the mob itself acquires an autonomy. The individuals give up autonomy, right? So as an individual in a mob, you have very little autonomy. Good luck breaking out of the dynamic of the mob, and woe to anyone who tries to resist it, right? Because the mob primarily it gains in brute physical power, in the capacity to inflict violence or to achieve other ends through the application of the pressure of potential violence, the threat of it. That's why it remains the case that storming a power center with pitchforks and so on, that still gets shit done. The threat of that violence is very real when you're dealing with large groups. And incidentally, that's why that kind of stuff is protected in the American Constitution. There's a reason for those gun laws. And there's a reason for freedom of assembly. The right to protest with the threat of violence, at least, is protected. That's for a good reason. That's one of the last fail-safes, as it were, to ensure that the people can retain control of the giant, weird government system that we're kind of forced to that we're all forced to exist with. It has to be kept in check, and ultimately the way to do that is through engineering who has access to the power in a given society. So if you see, oh gosh, the state is going to have all this crazy power, all this physical power, we need some basic something in there to compensate for that. so that if it came down to it, the people have a fighting chance against a government that has, for whatever reason, made criminals out of its own populace, And so it's interesting that, the right to form an angry mob is kind of it's not specifically anywhere in the Constitution as a right, I assume, but it's just barely danced around. That's really, I would say, we do have that right. We have other rights that, taken together, sum to angry mob bearing arms is allowed to yell and scream at the government. Whether or not they're allowed to actually exercise violence, you see the definitions start to break down there. Who's doing the allowing? I mean, in that case, there's a war between the government and the people. There is no real rule of law anymore in that kind of situation anyway. At that point, we have to start talking about ethics. And I don't know what you think about all that, but I side with the people, not with the tyrannical government. So I'm rooting for them. Back to the idea of these group effects, though. They gain in a lot of power, but their autonomy is driven by some very cognitively de-resed process. The mob mind does not have the nuance, the intelligence, the subtlety, and critically, the caution of an individual mind. It tends to be very, well, it's so funny because on the one hand, it's very single-pointedly focused. The mob is out for blood, typically, and it's going to get it somewhere. But mobs also become very influenceable at the same time, because the mob is so hungry to eat something, you see. It's very easy for someone with the right skills at the right time, kind of before it's become too unruly. But as the mob is just being born, like the little baby mob, people can come in and really gain control of that baby mob and point them in the direction of a target that they would prefer that mob eat. And so it's dumb, obviously. The mob is stupid in a way, easy to influence, therefore. And that's not true about most individual people. Most people are not dumb, because we define all of this stuff relative to the average. Funny joke there. But most people are averagely smart. And in my experience, that's pretty fucking smart. People are smart. Especially people that are pulling from all of their resources, listening to their intuition, not just to their intellect, and etc. People that are doing that are really, really smart. They figure stuff out. And we way overemphasize the left hemispheric intellectual aspects in our culture. Intuition can make up for a lot. And it's a kind of intelligence too. Thank you very much. So I think most people I meet are tremendously smart. And most people I meet are also quite compassionate. It's the group effects that really get us as human beings. And I include in that, to me, isolation is a group effect. There is no isolation unless it's in reference to the idea of a group. To be isolated means to be isolated from the group. So there is no such thing as isolation without the fact that we're built to exist in groups. And all of these problems, it's all problems about how we relate to others, obviously. This is just central kind of human condition stuff. But what am I trying to say? It's like a systems level idea. We've generated a higher order process by coming together as a group. In this case, we're just talking about a mob. But there are other kinds of things, The whole society is this kind of big emergent group process. But it can be observed that these group processes have their own dynamics that are not under the control of any individual person in the group. So that's emergence. There's a real emergent something there. And emergent things, I don't know, it seems to be somehow the same way in nature. Look at something like not a proper cyclone, but there's just, what are those called? There's those little vortices of wind that can form sometimes. Have you ever seen one of those? Like if you've ever been to Montana or something, you've probably seen these things. This be this like spontaneous little micro tornado of like dust and debris on the side of the road, etc. A very simple shape is organizing a bunch of matter that before was disconnected, but now they're all doing the same thing. They're all rotating around this big spiral thing, which is caused by something going on in the air, which exerts force on those little bits. Now, in that example, it's some kind of funny feedback loop, I would assume. And as it starts to form, it forms more and more and more and gets exponentially harder to stop, probably. The air pushes the air, pushes the air, pushes the air, and you have a positive loop. But it's unstable, see? And it decoheres just as quickly. But then sometimes you see a really big tornado. And it's not going to decohere that quickly. It will eventually, but it's going to stick and do a lot of damage. So one question would be, at what level have the people transformed into a mob in the United States? Well, I don't think it's exactly cyclone levels yet, but it could grow. And that's the thing, it's like the virus. Effects like that could grow exponentially given the right situation. And then before you know it, we could be in a situation where there's really not a lot of consciousness anymore. People are just flying around in that higher order process, which always becomes relatively simple, you see, at least to start with. And there's a funny paradox there, isn't there? That a simple ordering process like a spiral loop could then generate all this chaos. There's a self-reinforcing feedback process occurring in the group because everyone's confirming the reality definitions. Yeah, that's right. Last week he said this to my mother. Yeah, I heard that he kicked, so-and-so's dog down the, and everybody gets into a frenzy, and then they go out and kill the ostracized individual or whatever it is. They burn the witch, Well, so, okay. Here's the next part of this idea. If you're a performer trying to gain the ear of the group, I guess I'll leave suspended for the moment what your intention is once you get that ear. Although that's quite to the point, ultimately, of course. But if you're a performer trying to gain access to these ears, there are a few different ways you might go about it. One way is you might appeal to things of the category lowest common denominator, You might pick topics that there's a lot of basic agreement about. It's going to depend on the group. If it's a group of like working class people, you're going to know that there are certain anxieties and real struggles and etc. that affect that demographic. You're going to know that everyone feels like they're not being paid enough and they're being taken advantage of in some way. Because that, you can play on that with the group. You see, the group wants to agree because that creates an easy peace. So if you give them things initially that they can all agree on easily, you glue them tightly together. And that's, it's like you're working on a recipe. It's terrible. These are human beings, but it is like that. First you're gonna glue the group together by appealing to sort of so-called everyman kind of topics. It's especially good if you can focus on grievances and things that are also going to make the group a little emotional and agitated. So you're trying to bind them together with agitation. And then eventually the group is cohering so nicely, and you've emerged as a kind of the natural logos orating center that is helping the group achieve this internal peace. You become the implicit king. And then they're going to listen to whatever you say following that, basically. So there's like this priming stage, you see. And then you deliver the payload, which is, and by the way, it's group X, or etc., that group Y, that's responsible for all of your problems. So go take care of them for me, please, says the implicit king, who then becomes the actual king. You can see why many ancient societies have notions about magical speech and etc. Speech can cast a spell on the big mob monster and do something to it. It can mobilize it against a group, but it might also cohere it into a community. And part of what Girard helps us understand is those are often the same thing. Communities are formed out of group violence effects in some way. In other words, the two things are not kind of incidental or even very decoupled, but that they're part of the same process in human beings. The establishment of a society, at least for the most part throughout history, has been the same thing as the establishment of rule through the application of violence wielded by groups. So who controls those groups? That can, who gets to control the police in a society? Well, it's the people that make the laws, and that all has to do with language, and it's the people who make the laws were initially the people who were able to mobilize the groups. So this stuff is very central and critical in this domain of human power structures. Oh God, I don't even remember what normal is. I really hope I have full ownership of my body again soon. I don't like having this foreign thing in it. The stent is gross. Incidentally, I find all that stuff very linked up. That's often how you can get groups to do very horrible things, is by skeezing them out at the level of body metaphor. Because that's a very basic thing. It's not good to have a foreign body in your body. That means there's a parasite in you, or a weapon has penetrated you, or etc. It's not a good state. And so we all have a visceral body level reaction to that sort of scenario. So if you can paint some other scenario using metaphorical language that appeals to like body things like that in some way, especially if you can do it in a way where that's not explicit exactly, but just nearly explicit, I think that can be very effective. It's just, you can just see it in what Hitler did. It became all about purity. So it's talking about disease and things that might infect the body parasitically or virally. And when there are actual situations like that, like I have this stent in and there's a pandemic going on, human beings will get emotional if you put things in body language like that. And again, it doesn't have to be explicit. You don't have to say the Jews are parasites. You might say that explicitly eventually, once you've gained sort of full control of the mob. But initially it might have to be a little bit subtler, because everyone's still trying to save face initially. They're all still members of the society, which is a less violent and less insane version of a mob or something. Maybe. Society is a complicated one. Single sentence definitions are probably never going to exhaust it. You need every individual to feel like you're addressing them personally, that you really know their individual struggle. If you can make every individual feel addressed, then you earn a loyalty that will transcend the immediate spell of the group, put it that way. Because eventually that group is going to fragment a little bit. People go back home. Then they're on their own again. They regain some cognitive autonomy again. They can think about it again. What do you want them thinking about later? We want them to be thinking, gosh, that guy in the town square today, he really said stuff that made a lot of sense. And I really felt like he understood my life. And so I'm going to go back there. You got to kind of keep their attention on you and not thinking so much about what's happening to them in that group. You have to keep that all a bit invisible, see? So it's my connection with this person. It's not that I'm a part of a Trump group. I'm just here for Donald. Like all these other people happen to be. But each one is individually, we're individually, authentically related to the great leader. That would be ideal from the standpoint of this kind of thing, right? So how do demagogues, dictators, street performers, musicians, celebrities, priests, shamans, Christs, etc. do this stuff? How do they do all these things? Because that's a big challenge. In fact, at first it seems like an impossible challenge. How can you possibly address every individual if what you're doing is trying to address a group? You only have one mouth. You're standing there on the top of the mountain or whatever it is, and you've used some mana that you have, like whatever that is, your ability to kind of summon everyone in the town. Maybe that's something you have just through magnetic attraction, or because you're already a bit of a leader, or maybe you were born into that, or maybe it's because you've demonstrated great something over the course of your life that your culture values, and so there's some trust invested in you. Or maybe you've just waited for the right moment and then kind of burst onto the scene with a big, crazy, amped up persona, and it's very calculated in that way, and you're a performer who's waited for just the right time to take the spotlight, and you take it. Whatever the situation is, you get all the people assembled, now you have to say something to them. Well, in fact, that's very difficult to do initially, and so if you look at how cults form, it's often very one-on-one to start with. You get one follower at a time, and in that scenario you can, you're both going to address the group, and that's its own game with its own rules. Then you're also going to address each individual, and that's going to be a separate game with different rules, and the two games intersect, and etc. It's all about maintaining your control as the cult master, And there are various sorts of strategies you might employ there, sort of in addition to that. You isolate people from the normal group, the actual dominant group, if you're a cult trying to grow. You got to break people away from all those reality definitions in some way so that you can set up the new reality definitions. Eventually, of course, that becomes impossible. As the size of the group grows, you're not going to be able to address individuals anymore, except for the individuals that then become part of your sort of internal direct power structure interface, the sort of the cabal that you build around yourself, etc. You'll interact with those people as individuals, but the group becomes really truly a group. But so the thing is, you still want to make that group feel like You're talking to each person as an individual, and so to do that you have to employ pretty sophisticated rhetorical strategies. And basically the technique is that you just say things that are ambiguous, which is another way of saying things that have multidimensional meaning engineered into them. Now there's ways to do that that are more and less advanced, you know? There's a lot of subtlety here. You can just say kind of vague, cryptic, ambiguous things all the time. And well, that will actually work, terrifyingly. That's how weird these group dynamics are. If you just say things that kind of sound vaguely profound, like you can identify sort of the alchemical trick right away of saying, you know, everything is what it is and its opposite, you know, and you can just perform that over and over again in a very machinic like way. Like every situation someone brings you can just say, yes, that's true, but also, you know, and then you say the exact inverted thing. And people will fall for that for a long time, partly because there is, of course, a real wisdom in that, if it's applied with discretion and coherence of like thought and intention, you know. But also because people want to believe that they're hearing something profound and that they've understood something profound. And so it's just a lot about how you set up the tone and the frame of it. And that one in particular also has this quality of being a binary, because it's an alchemical thing, and so that makes it already a bit more sophisticated, I'd say, because it has a Janus quality there, where you can appeal to very different kinds of people simultaneously, if you acknowledge two diametrically opposed sides of a situation, and then offer some kind of a compromise would be the weaker way. A real unity or synthesis would be the much more impressive way. It's one thing to sort of say, hey, look, I see what the green folks are saying, and I see what the purple folks are saying, and how about the green folk just give up 50% of this and the purple folk just can learn to do without that, and then you both do this? Would that work for everyone? And people kind of begrudgingly say, yeah, okay, I guess so. You know, that's good. You've established a basic piece. People feel things are basically fair. But it's much better if you can say, look, the green folk believe this, the purple folk believe this, but I believe that there's not much difference, actually, between what the green people want and the purple people want. Don't you see how these are actually the same thing? And they're really, you know, then you haven't, it's what Stafford Beer, the systems theorist, used to say, then you haven't solved a problem, you've dissolved a problem. Exactly, you just make the problem vanish, in a way, by showing it to be the result of, now, maybe you're doing this as a trick, or maybe it's authentic, but by showing it to be the result of a frame issue. So you'll just shift the frame for people and say, no, here's this bigger frame where we're all working together. Really good leaders know how to do that, who are both good leaders and good orators. I would imagine Abe Lincoln would be a person to study for technique like that. But so, sort of the most basic and simple form of this would be even less precisely engineered than that sort of alchemical maneuver, binary thing of let's acknowledge the thing and its opposite. You could just be sort of generally obscurantist in the things that you say. And the thing is that, you know, that will actually work pretty well for a while, because it's just like you're presenting verbal Rorschach tests to people. Everything you say is just ambiguous. People can't quite figure out what you're saying. That means that they have to interpret a little bit. And people will tend to interpret in a way that suits whatever's going on in their frame. That will allow everyone to feel as if they're having a very intense individual relationship with you, because they're going to be kind of trying to figure you out. and it's intriguing to people, but it's quite unwieldy because of the fact that you're just sort of floating ambiguous cloud after ambiguous cloud. People are going to start to project. You don't know what people are going to project into those clouds, essentially. So some people might end up thinking, they might end up hating you if they kind of persistently interpret these ambiguous clouds in unfavorable ways. Other people are going to like you. So, but it's going to be hard to predict, and therefore harder to maintain control. So that's a it's not a very effective strategy, especially over the long run. It's much more effective to sort of analyze the group. And you're going to know things about it just because it's a group. So you're going to have all the basic human group psychology, fears and anxieties and drives and etc. to play with. That's like the basic palette. But then there's going to be particular shades, hues available according to the historicized and sort of local particular aspects of the group. You might know, okay, this group is basically made up of these sorts of people. Some of them come from here, some of them come from there. Here are the histories involved. I know these things about the group, therefore I will use them. I will craft very particular sorts of ambiguous statements that can't just be read any old way, but can be read in a favorable way by exactly these 3 or 4 primary overlapping demographics that I'm trying to get to in the group. So you don't slice it all the way down to individual yet. You just slice the group up into some bigger segments, though, and then you try to create speech and imagery and story and all the things you can do with speech, or that can be sort of united with speech these days. If you go to a rally, you're probably looking at a bunch of video and etc. So all these things are working together. So it's a multidimensional engineering task. You're trying to overlay. You're trying to lay the structural foundations that will support multiple interpretations on the other side, and to do that in a way that's quite crafted, actually, so that you're going to fork people into one of a few pre-designed interpretive areas that what you say strongly suggests. And if you can do that with great skill, in a way where people don't see, because they don't have time maybe, and for other reasons that are kind of to do with sleight of hand, that people don't see that that's happening, so they're not aware of the other paths. They're not aware that you've said an ambiguous thing. They think you said a thing that's quite clear, and in their frame it's going to look very clear, and they'll just ignore or find some other way to rationalize or dismiss the few little pieces of information that seem disjoint from their context. And if everyone's doing that, and particularly if it's one of these weird new kinds of groups, where it's not actually a physical group in a physical space so much, but it's people boxed up in their little apartments or in their family units in houses, isolated. It's a group, but it's not a group. There's no physical sort of interference. So in that case, it's going to be easier to pull off this sort of maneuver, I would imagine, because you're not receiving sort of reality consensus effects from the group, just from the imagined group, which you imagine is all just like you, making the same interpretive choices at each stage of understanding what the magical mono-wielding leader person is telling you, you know. So that's one strategy. What I described there is quite subtle, difficult thing. Another thing that you might do, though, is you might just be really, really divisive. At least in the short term and maybe in certain ways. I think that must be inherently unstable, would be my guess. Trump employs kind of mixed strategies, you know. I think he does do what I was just describing, although he's quite clumsy with it, really. I mean, you can just see him doing it, like, because he'll just straight up, it's so funny, actually. He'll just straight up, like, say something, and then immediately afterwards be like, or maybe not, I don't know, you know? Like, he'll just immediately pull, like, a obscurantizing, like, retreat. I guess he's counting on the confidence of his presentation or something, like, masking the fact that, the people are just going to say, well, he's just being honest, that, like, and humble, that, hey, there could be more information here or something. So some people will interpret it that way, but then the people who want to interpret it as people will just relate it back to whatever they need to relate it back to. Trump really seems he understands that. You just have to give people the material out of which they're going to build their own model of you and what's going on. And that's better than brute forcing some kind of unity message into their head. You're going to do that too, but it's going to be in a more base kind of way. Then on top of that, you're going to mix these other strategies probably. But so just being divisive is a way to ascend to the top of the mountain. And that probably is true in, like, more traditional societies as well, I would imagine. Like, look, if you're a person in a community that just gets a big reaction, positive or negative or something, but just, like, dramatic reactions out of every person you meet, eventually there's going to be a group consensus that's going to be something like, what the fuck is going on with this person? Everyone has a different opinion about him. We're all talking about him, her, etc. We're all talking about this person. Hey person, what the hell's going on with you? And so there'd be an opportunity then to address the group, The thing about that is it's very risky to do that. If you're really divisive, the group might come down and just decide that you're just a threat, or you might be a threat, and so we'll just kill you because who wants to deal with some obvious weird chaotic force moving through the social body, so different groups will have different sorts of reactions to these things, and it's a lot about knowing your group and how much you can get away with. If you're a bit divisive, people actually like that. Being a little bit divisive in the sense of having a few unpopular opinions, or I mean, look, it depends on how radicalized a society is and various other factors, but usually in a healthy society, people actually tend to admire that sort of thing. They don't want someone who has perfectly sort of scrubbed, sanctioned views and opinions on everything. They would like someone who seems like they're a little bit of an outside of the box thinker, a little bit of a dangerous thinker, because people know that can be an advantage. And that's an instinctual thing. Good leaders often have a little bit of that. If you have too much of it, it can be a problem, etc. So people have a natural ability to size up would-be leaders that way. But also because of these group effects, that ability is weakened in a group. The ability of an individual to size up another individual is very weakened when you're in a group that individual seems to be controlling in some way. And that's established just by the basic scenario of everyone else is being silent so that the one may speak. That's the special one that may speak. The rest of us sit here passively and listen. And so just the bare fact of I'm a member of a big group, but this person in the spotlight is the one who's commanding the attention. The one who commands the attention is like a sorcerer, you see. They're controlling this, and you think, I couldn't do that. I could never gain control of a whole room of people like this. Of course, you probably could. It's the amazing thing about it. It's actually not that hard. You just have to do something novel. And then once you get the attention, you hopefully can roll with it. Then it becomes tricky. It's not, anyone can get the attention. Just scream the word penis really loudly in a public space. People will turn to look at you. But then what? So it's not so incorrect to think of these people as sorcerers in that sort of sense. Because it's weird for me to use that term metaphorically, because I also believe in literal sorcery. But it is an appropriate metaphor to use here. And perhaps it is a form of literal sorcery. Anyway. You see, this is the thing, the division approach at whatever level you're deploying it. Because maybe you're trying to divide the group from external influences, or maybe you're trying to just divide the group against all such possible influences to make it kind of warlike and hostile towards other groups, just because there are other groups, you know. Or maybe it's more internally oriented than that. You're trying to divide people within the group from each. I mean, that's a very bad thing to be doing. And I think that's part of what Trump is doing, is he's allowing a lot of internal divisions to entrench deeper and deeper. And it's an interesting double edge there, because it also has the effect of making them more visible. So Trump is like a die moving through the gastrointestinal system of the social body, so that we can X-ray it and see the structure. He illuminates the lines of division, and so that you know, things that generate divisions in the group like that are it works, obviously. There's a certain, especially in today's weird situation, it seems like that's a way to climb a network really quickly, is to be divisive, but then I think it's quite unstable. And it's also just kind of like, I don't know, it's like the equivalent of blues pentatonic scales over and over and over and over again on guitar or something, you know, like Guitar Center jam aesthetic, you know. It's just done a lot because it's easy to do. It's harder to come with a unifying message, to say, here's actually how we're the same. If you can do that, though, there's nothing else like it. Because real lasting groups are built on a foundation of a recognition of sameness. And achieving that recognition of sameness through an emphasis on the difference from the other is a very regressive sort of strategy. I mean, I would think for obvious reasons. Well, okay, that feels like a more or less natural stopping point. I'm sure there's much more to say about all this stuff, but in the future, as per usual. Goodbye.